Talking Trees with Lily and Jad. Welcome to Talking Trees, your everyday journey into the world of tree conservation. In today's episode, we delve into the European Red List of Trees, a landmark document offering the first comprehensive assessment of the extinction risks facing all native European tree species. Developed by IUCN and BGCI, with contributions from numerous experts and support from the European Commission's LIFE program, this report identifies threatened species across Europe, examines key challenges such as invasive species and deforestation, and provides recommendations for protecting these trees in situ and ex situ. This essential tool guides conservation efforts and shapes policies to preserve Europe's rich tree diversity. Join us as we uncover the insights behind this critical resource.
Okay, so today's deep dive is going to be something that I'm sure you deal with literally every day.
Right.
But we're not talking about just any trees. We're talking about the future of European forests.
Okay.
And a pretty alarming report called the European Red List of Trees.
Yeah, so this report's basically a health checkup for all 454 tree species that are native to Europe. And what I think is so fascinating about it is that it doesn't just, list the names of the species. It actually meticulously evaluates their risk of extinction based on these really specific criteria. It uses those globally recognized IUCN Red List categories and criteria.
That might disappear.
You got it.
And that's a little scary.
It is.
And a shocking 42% of European tree species are threatened.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, as arborists, you guys are always, trying to diversify your planting palettes.
Right.
Imagine losing almost half of your options.
That's what we're looking at, potentially.
That's the reality we're facing.
It's pretty serious. And that actually puts trees as the third most threatened group in Europe.
Wow.
Right behind freshwater mollusks.
Okay.
And there's this category called policy plants, which are just species that have been, selected for conservation concern.
Wow, that's a pretty sobering thought.
Yeah.
What is driving this crisis? I mean, trees are pretty tough, right? What's putting them at such risk?
Well, it's definitely a combo of factors, but if you had to pick like a public enemy number one, it's got to be invasive species.
Oh.
I mean, you've probably seen firsthand the damage that, things like the leaf miner moth can do to horse chestnut populations.
Totally.
Or, diseases like ash ibex,
right,
just wiping out entire stands.
Those are definitely, we're on the front lines of those battles every day.
Right.
And it feels like it's getting even harder,
Yeah.
With global trade and climate change, just kind of creating more opportunities for these things to spread.
Creating pathways, and it's such a complex problem with no easy solutions, unfortunately.
Right.
And then on top of that, you have, that constant deforestation and the way that land use is always changing. I mean, forests are constantly being cleared for agriculture, urban sprawl infrastructure projects.
Totally.
It's like we're squeezing trees out of their own homes.
Yeah, it's like there's just less and less space for them. And then on top of that, you're saying there's these invasive species.
Exactly. The threats are piling up.
Yeah. And one thing I was reading in the report that I thought was kind of interesting is they were talking about how, a high percentage of European trees are actually found in protected areas like Natura 2000, national parks, nature reserves. I'm always a little skeptical about how much impact these things really have.
Oh, sure.
Because it seems like there are always loopholes, workarounds, and how do we know they're actually effective?
That's a totally valid concern. And the truth is, the effectiveness of protected areas, it really does vary a lot.
Okay.
So you'll have some that are incredibly well managed, really well funded, and they have strict enforcement, and they do a great job.
Okay.
And then you have others that are struggling with limited resources, or they have challenges with enforcement.
So it's not just a silver bullet.
No, not at all. And sometimes, the management might not be specifically focused on like the needs of individual tree species.
Okay.
So they might be doing a good job of protecting like the overall habitat, but not necessarily like every tree within it. Okay, so they also talked about the role of botanic gardens, arborvitae, and seed banks. And this kind of seems like, having a backup copy for our forests.
Yeah, it's like an insurance policy for plant diversity.
It is reassuring to know that 87% of European trees are represented in collections worldwide.
Okay.
However, there is a catch.
32
32 threatened species are still missing
Wow.
entirely
You don't have them anywhere.
from these collections. Yeah, so there are still these gaps,
For safety net.
like key pieces of the puzzle.
Exactly.
And that brings us to this
Yeah.
kind of interesting case study that they highlighted in the report.
Okay.
And that is the Sorbus genus.
Ah, Sorbus, yes.
So apparently,
Fascinating group of trees.
3/4 of the 170 or so.
Over 170 species in Europe. Sorbus species in Europe are threatened. So, I mean, that's a huge proportion.
It is.
So tell me a little bit about Sorbus. What's going on with them?
Well, the Sorbus genus, which includes trees like the rowan and the mountain ash,
Okay.
it's incredibly complex.
Mhm.
They have this really unusual reproductive strategy
Okay.
that involves hybridization.
So, yeah.
Like, you get different species crossbreeding, and that creates tons of new varieties.
Wow. So that's part of why there's so many of them.
That's one of the reasons, yeah. And then on top of that, they often have multiple sets of chromosomes.
Multiple sets.
Yeah, which is a phenomenon called polyploidy.
Polyploidy.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, for those of us who haven't, brushed up on our botany, like, what exactly does that mean?
So think of chromosomes as like instruction manuals
Okay.
for building a tree.
Okay.
Most trees have 2 sets,
Okay.
one from each parent.
Okay.
But Sorbus species, they often have extra sets.
Extra sets of instructions.
Yeah, and this leads to more diverse traits,
Mm.
but it also makes their reproduction more complex.
So it's like too many cooks in the kitchen.
Kind of, yeah. You get some unique and interesting results, but it can also make things a bit more chaotic and vulnerable.
And on top of that,
Yeah.
a lot of these Sorbus species reproduce through apomixis,
Yes.
which I guess means
Which means they basically clone themselves through seeds.
they clone themselves, so they're not even
It's like they're making photocopies of themselves.
having sex with other trees.
Not in the traditional sense, no.
They're just like, I'm just going to make a copy of myself.
Exactly. Which is remarkable.
That's wild.
It is, but it also kind of creates this paradox
Okay.
because while it's contributed to this high number of unique Sorbus species,
Yeah.
it also means that a lot of them exist in these very small, isolated populations,
Gotcha.
which makes them incredibly vulnerable.
So this is all really interesting.
Yeah.
But I want to make sure we don't get too lost
Sure.
in the Sorbus world here,
No problem.
because I want to talk about some of the bigger picture
Okay.
things that they highlighted in the report
Sounds good.
in terms of, solutions and things like that. So they talked about protected areas,
Right.
but we kind of already talked about that.
Yeah, we touched on that.
So what are some of the other strategies that are being used to try to combat these threats?
Well, research and monitoring are absolutely crucial. Scientists are constantly working to try to understand
Yeah.
how climate change is impacting tree health, how these invasive species are spreading, and how we can, fight back against tree diseases.
Yeah.
So there's a ton of work going on in that area. And we also have organizations like the International Plant Sentinel Network, which are basically like an early warning system, constantly scanning for new threats. They're looking out for potential outbreaks and new invasive species and all that.
That's reassuring.
It is. There are people out there actively working to protect these trees.
Okay, good. Because it's
Yeah.
easy to get a little
I know.
overwhelmed by all this.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
But there are definitely reasons to be hopeful.
Okay, good. I'm glad to hear that.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess one of the other things that they highlighted in the report
Okay.
were the unique challenges that are faced by trees on European islands.
European islands are so interesting. They're like little evolutionary laboratories. You often find species there that are found nowhere else on Earth.
Like what?
Well, think about those incredible laurel forests in the Canary Islands.
Okay.
Or like the ancient olive groves that you
Yeah.
find all over the Mediterranean.
Right?
They've really managed to preserve.
Like there are these little time capsules.
Yeah, it's like a glimpse into the past.
Yeah.
These unique pieces of evolutionary history.
Okay, so they're cool.
They are. But that isolation that's created all this amazing diversity,
Right.
it also makes these island ecosystems incredibly fragile.
How so?
Well, they've evolved in a very specific context,
Okay.
often with a limited gene flea
Okay.
from the mainland.
So like they're kind of inbred.
Yeah, and that makes them more susceptible to things like
Gotcha.
invasive species,
Okay.
habitat loss.
And then there's not very many of them to begin with.
Right, exactly. And many of these island species exist in these small, localized populations.
Yeah.
So even a small-scale disturbance can have a huge impact.
Like what?
Well, imagine like a volcanic eruption
Oh, yeah.
on a small island.
Totally.
Or the introduction of just a single invasive predator.
Yeah, that would totally change everything.
It can completely reshape the entire ecosystem.
And on a more practical level, protecting these island ecosystems
Yes,
also benefits the people who live there
absolutely.
because these forests, they provide essential services. Okay, so what else?
Well, another crucial factor is addressing those threats that don't stop at park boundaries.
Okay, like what?
So, things like invasive species and climate change.
Right.
These things require coordinated efforts across much larger landscapes.
Yeah.
And that often involves, multiple stakeholders. You got to get landowners involved, local communities, government agencies.
So it's not just about creating these isolated islands.
Exactly.
Protect.
So it's about fostering a network of interconnected areas and collaborative management strategies.
So it's all about recognizing that, nature doesn't adhere to human-drawn boundaries.
It doesn't care about our maps and lines.
Right? I mean, that makes sense. It's kind of like what we were talking about earlier with the islands. They're isolated, but they're also connected to this larger ecosystem.
Exactly. It's all about the big picture.
And so with all these challenges and threats facing European trees, it's easy to get overwhelmed and lose hope.
It is.
What message would you leave our listeners with, especially those who are working hard every day to protect these trees?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that you're not alone in this fight. There's a whole community of people who are passionate about trees and dedicated to their conservation.
Yeah.
And there are amazing organizations out there doing incredible work to protect these forests.
So it's about finding those people, finding those organizations, and getting involved.
Exactly. And even small actions can make a difference. Planting a tree in your yard, educating your neighbors about invasive species, supporting local conservation groups. It all adds up.
So it's not about feeling like you have to solve all the problems yourself.
No, it's about doing what you can.
It's about taking action.
Exactly. And remember, trees are resilient. They've survived for millions of years. They'll find a way.
Yeah, we just have to give them a fighting chance.
Exactly.
Well, that's a great message to end on, I think. It's been a really fascinating deep dive into the European Red List of trees.
It has.
And I think it's a powerful reminder that, we need to act now to protect these vital species.
We do.
And the ecosystems they support.
Absolutely.
So whether you're an arborist working in the field, a researcher studying these trees, or simply someone who, appreciates the beauty and importance of forests, we all have a role to play.
We do, and we all need to work together.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that the fate of these trees is in our hands.
It is.
We can choose to ignore the warnings, or we can choose to act, to learn to share and to protect.
And to protect.
So let's choose to act.
Let's do it.
Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us, folks. And as always, remember to stay curious.
Thank you for joining us on today's episode of Talking Trees. We've explored the European Red List of Trees, a pivotal document that assesses the extinction risks of native European tree species and highlights the urgent threats of invasive species and deforestation. With expert guidance and strategic recommendations for both in situ and ex situ protection, this report is a cornerstone in shaping conservation policies and preserving Europe's botanical heritage. Until next time, keep advocating for and nurturing the green legacy that sustains us.